Hi, everyone. Welcome to Identity Crisis, a show from the Shalom Hartman Institute creating better conversations about the issues facing Jewish life today. I'm Yehuda Kurtzer. We're recording on June 29th, 2026. So yesterday, as part of our community leadership program here at Hartman in Jerusalem, I led a tiyul, a field trip, down the Mount of Olives into the Old City, through the Via Dolorosa and into the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, and then down to the Western Wall Plaza. The theme of the day was the City of God. And I used the seemingly eternal context of Jerusalem and its ancient rocks to explore some big questions, like the paradox of human sovereignty over holy places, which are holy because they belong to God and can't really belong to people. We talked about conditional holiness, how Jewish tradition wrestles with whether places are permanently holy or whether their holiness depends on human behavior. And perhaps more importantly for our purposes today, we talked about the complicated relationship between real geography, the study of the earth and its features, and sacred geography, how religion and belief transform real places into something else entirely. One of the main characters on our trip, an exemplar of a critical figure in the history of sacred geography, was Helena, mother of Constantine. Helena traveled to Jerusalem in the 4th century, where, according to church legend, she discovered the true cross of Jesus and established the site of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre on that site, which was the site of Hadrian's temple to Venus from the 2nd century, which Constantine then razed to build the church. Well, how did Helena find it? I would say faith marks territory. Moderns mock this idea, but they do it too. Yigal Yadin, the legendary archaeologist who excavated Masada, famously did so with a copy of Josephus's The Jewish War in his hands, which influenced how he interpreted what he saw in front of him, and some of which is now contested by scholars who have followed. In a broader sense, scholar of religion Jonathan Z. Smith has an article called Map is Not Territory, in which he argues that scholars themselves use all sorts of categories and descriptors of religion, what he calls as maps, that are not actually transparent windows into religion itself. A map is already an interpretation and a matter of choice. So in all these cases, whether it's a person of faith who is marking territory based on their previous commitments, or the scholar studying that person of faith and their choices, all of it is rooted in pre-existing knowledge, whether it's faith or a different kind of belief in truth. When I was 15, I came on a religious Zionist youth group trip to Israel with Bnei Akiva. As we traveled around the country, maps and Bibles in hand, I was riveted by how seeing these places of Jewish antiquity that had shaped our core narratives created for me a sense of continuity that I felt between past and present. I couldn't believe I was standing in the very spot that, according to the book of Joshua, Joshua had given the order for the sun to pause its movement over the town of Givon to enable the Israelite conquest, or that I could stand amidst the stones that were the foundations of ancient rabbinic enclaves in the Galilee. I felt at one with the past, and continuity was its gift. Instead of seeing the rise of Zionism as a secular project, a departure from the continuity of nearly 2,000 years of diaspora history, I felt as a religious Zionist that everything now kind of worked. Well, it wasn't the Messianic age yet, but here were all the conditions to make it possible. The Jewish people had returned to history and our narrative. The map had to become the territory. My views have changed since that time. I'm still enchanted by the ancient rocks and the story they tell. That's why I continue to lead those tiyulim. But I understand now all the ways that archaeology here is politics, and the Bible in its usage in Israel is politics, and the ways that grand historical and faith-based narratives obscure the human realities on the ground. I understand the complexity of the rise of Zionism and modern ideological influences, and I see, especially in the past decade, the deep moral crisis that has emerged in a religious Zionist movement that has spawned, or maybe even evolved into, a fascist and fundamentalist political party in Israel. Maps are not territories, but sometimes they are actual plans for territorial conquest, and maps formed by absolutists can become dangerous canon. All of you know the story of this danger in Israel because you can't avoid the news. In the past 3 years, incidents of what is known as settler violence in Israel, although some people contest that term because they want to identify that its roots are not merely in the settlements, but that phenomenon consists of violence against Palestinian civilians perpetrated by mostly young Israelis, many of whom live in occupied territories. Those events have become more than daily occurrences, now numbering into the thousands every year. It almost feels like it needs a Hebrew word, like intifada, which was a signifier of a violent and chaotic campaign against Israeli civilians. The IDF frequently stands idly by. The police are under the control of nationalist Itamar Ben-Gvir. But the truth is that's only a marginal example of the challenge here. The larger issue, I would say, is ideological. With a widespread empathy recession in Israel, not only among religious Zionists, but Zionists more broadly, an empathy recession for casualties on the other side of the conflict. Now, you can say this is common in armed conflicts. I would say most people in human history did not lose a lot of sleep about the victims on the other side of the wars that their societies were facing. The difference here, though, is that ultimately Israelis and Palestinians are inextricable long-term in ways that are so different from a war between countries that have demarcated boundaries and clearer ethnic divisions. Inside the country, anti-Palestinian sentiment shapes Israeli attitudes inside the Green Line towards Palestinian citizens of Israel, and Israel turns further inward against what it perceives as the false morality of the West. Meanwhile, the movement of Zionism seems to be changing its core narrative from trying to advance a city on a hill to trying to build a Masada-like fortress. The maps are changing, the territory is evolving. What does moral and religious leadership demand in a moment like this? In that spirit, I'm speaking today with Rabbi Zachary Truboff, the director of the Institute for Agunah Research and Education at the International Beit Din, but specifically today about his latest book, which is called Zionism in Crisis, Jewish Power and Moral Responsibility After October 7th. He made Aliyah in 2018. He's ordained as a modern Orthodox rabbi, both from Yeshivat Chovevei Torah in New York and from Rav Zalman Nehemiah Goldberg, I suppose, here. Made Aliyah again 8 years ago, worked as a rabbi in Cleveland, now lives in Jerusalem with his family. Thanks for being here today, Zach. I laid out some of the, I would say, the symptoms of the crisis that you describe in Zionism, but maybe you could start with a kind of conceptual picture of what you think the real crisis here is in Zionism, and then we can talk about the question of the ways that we do or don't deploy religious language in talking about this crisis.
So it's an honor to be here, Yehuda. Thank you for having me. For me, the origin of the book, its genesis really begins in October 7th. It's the kind of day you don't forget, and it's the kind of day that changes people. It's the kind of day that changes states, for better and for worse. And for me, it was a realization that many of the dreams and hopes I had had about Zionism maybe weren't exactly what I thought them to be, right? When you make Aliyah, you come here believing the Jewish state will protect you, right? It's the whole point of Zionism. It's going to protect the Jews. And suddenly you find that may not be possible. And when you find that it may not be possible, it's not just, what choices have I made in my life? You start asking yourself bigger questions, such as, what choices have we made as a people that has brought us here? The Rambam Maimonides famously writes in his Laws of Fast that when crisis comes, our response has to be one of teshuvah, of repentance. And this is very interesting and in some ways surprising. It's surprising because, in truth, the Torah does not say that when a crisis comes, you fast, you do teshuvah. Right? What the Torah says, when a crisis comes, you blow the silver trumpets. In fact, when the Torah describes this, it describes a situation not that different from October 7th. If there is a war that finds its way to your land, you blow the chatzotzrot, you blow the silver trumpets, you'll be remembered by God. Now, we read that verse and we think on some level, and the Midrash picks up on this too, that if we blow those silver trumpets, God will save us, right? That's not maybe the most Zionist interpretation, right? The Zionists would say, when the crisis comes, we pick up our guns and we save ourselves. However, Maimonides locates another alternative about how we have to think about when the crisis comes. He says we blow the silver trumpets, but what that is supposed to be a signal for is for us to do teshuvah, for us to reflect on how we got here and what might be coming next. And the reason that's surprising is that when crisis comes, it is often the last thing that we will do to look inside of ourselves. So look at, again, where are we and how did we get here? Because when crisis comes, our immediate response is one of reactivity, right? We got to do something. As I said before, we got to get our guns. We got to kill the terrorists. We have to save our children. We have to bury our dead, right? There's a million things that come as part of that immediate response. Last thing you're going to ask yourself is, wait a second. Am I supposed to make a list of my sins? Am I supposed to pound my chest? It seems antithetical to what crisis ultimately demands of us. And even worse, if we start to ask questions of how we got here, our natural response is going to be ultimately, almost always, to blame others, right? If there's a crisis, right, our job is to find who's responsible. And it is almost never going to be ourselves, right? There's always somebody else to whom we can point the finger at. Now, for myself, part of the reason I say the book began in this moment is that October 7th was a moment that changed me very profoundly, and especially the war that followed. It wasn't my first brush with such a moment. I remember September 11th, 2001, very, very clearly. I was in college at the time. What I remember, particularly in the aftermath of that day, was the sense of collective trauma, national trauma, but also the sense that somebody evil had done something horrific to us, and we needed to fix that. And we needed to destroy them. Mm-hmm. And there could be nothing more good or more righteous or more holy than to do that. I remember that from, as I said, the aftermath of September 11th. And what I saw happening in Israel was a similar sensibility in the aftermath of October 7th. I was not somebody who felt that, oh my God, Israel's going to use military force in response. It was impossible for me to imagine a scenario where any state could absorb that kind of terror attack at that scale and not respond militarily. But at the same time, the question that I kept asking myself is, what's going to happen next? Like, what are we going to do? What are the limits going to be, right? In many ways, Hamas did October 7th to drag Israel into a war, a brutal, brutal, brutal war. It was designed almost for that very purpose. And it seemed to me, as a certain extent, that Israel was walking right into the jaws of that. Maybe knowing it, but also feeling like we don't really have a choice. This is what we must do. This is what is right. Now, what I saw in the months after October 7th and throughout the war, and this really gets to what is the crisis of Zionism, I came to realize it was less the sense that the state might not be able to protect me and my children. And what I saw instead in the broader discourse was an inability within Israeli society to be able to look at itself critically and ask itself, what exactly are we doing here? What exactly are the goals, right? Did the war have goals, the Gaza war? I mean, depends who you ask, right? Nitzachon muchlat, absolute victory. That was Bibi's slogan, so to speak. All right, wasn't really clear exactly what the goals were. We wanted to bring the hostages home, presumably we wanted to destroy Hamas, but it wasn't really clear exactly how we were going to go about doing that. There were a lot of questions, a lot of critical, important questions that needed to be asked. And what I saw is that anytime those questions were raised, there were basically three default responses that Israeli society provided itself. Yeah. If you asked if the war was just, you were told, remember October 7th. But if you asked, oh my God, we're killing lots of civilians, right, in trying to get Hamas, isn't that a problem? Should we think differently about what we're doing? We were told, it's really all Hamas's fault. They use them as human shields. And if anybody dared raise the fact that the international arena was criticizing Israel, right, we were immediately told, well, we shouldn't be listening to them. We know they're all anti-Semites. And with those three responses, we arrived at a situation where questions couldn't be asked, and then we couldn't even be honest with ourselves what might be happening. Mm-hmm. That, to me, was the moment of the crisis of Zionism, in no small part because I had previously saw myself as a Zionist, a liberal Zionist, right? Somebody who, like you said, believes that the future of the Jewish people in this land is dependent on its inextricable relation to the Palestinians. But at the same time, I'd always believed that when things got really bad, we wouldn't lose our soul. Mm-hmm. And in the months after October 7th, I had to realize that wasn't actually a guarantee. And that, to me, was what prompted, in many ways, the essays that appear in this book.
Yeah. Okay, I want to pick out a whole bunch of things that you talked about, because when you started, you said the initial crisis for you was a crisis of vulnerability. The second crisis makes more sense to me when you say, as I think many of us did, like, I think the military response on October 7th is not only inevitable, but arguably morally necessary. From the standpoint of Jewish tradition and human tradition, you know, the arguments that were made on October 8th by the anti-Israel movement that Israel should have sat idly by and repented for its sins as a result felt to me completely morally untenable. So I get when someone says after a year and a half, 2 years of war, where military objectives are no longer discernible, where the spate of civilian casualties is going on beyond what could be considered credible, where there's a genuine humanitarian crisis in Gaza, that to me as an evolution makes sense to then say, okay, how do we now re-engage with the question of our moral conscience? To me, that feels, by the way, like the founding moral question of the Shalom Hartman Institute, which was when the Jewish people actually have power, we're testing whether all of this tradition that sat on the shelves for 2,000 years as the theoretical construct by which we would govern ourselves as a state, whether we were actually as good morally as we thought we would be. But I'm struggling with the notion that I saw the crisis generated by vulnerability on October 7th. I saw a re-emergence of Chaim Nachman Bialik's City of Slaughter, of like, we're back here in pogroms. But I'm still struggling about why that's really a crisis when it was a temporary blip, but actually the state of Israel does ultimately protect the Jews. It can't ever protect all Jews, but it does protect the narrative of the Jewish people. So help me understand how you connect the dots between what feel like totally different crises that you see as continuous with each other.
Sure. So maybe to best answer that question, we should turn to the famous Zionist figure of Vladimir Jabotinsky.
Yeah.
All right. So Jabotinsky's Zionism is to a certain extent born in the aftermath of the Kishinev pogrom. Yeah. Right. He's a journalist at the time. He goes, he interviews survivors, he reports on what he sees. And Kishinev, ironically, it almost sounds strange to say this, was October 7th, but in a much smaller form.
Yeah, microcosm.
Right, a microcosm, which sounds crazy because if you're a Zionist, Kishinev looms large in our historical memory as a moment of, again, total catastrophe. Mm-hmm. But the reason that it looms so large and the reason that October 7th echoes it is that the Kishinev pogrom, like many pogroms at that time, represents a moment of profound Jewish powerlessness, right? The sense that not only that we cannot protect ourselves, we cannot protect the ones that we love most. And not only will we be viciously abused and killed and humiliated, there will be good people who stand by and do nothing, right? The authorities are the one who essentially allow pogroms to happen, right? Which you mentioned before, settler violence. If you look at Jewish history and look at the history of pogroms, violence doesn't just happen spontaneously and then... Right. There's nothing behind it, right? States are supposed to have, according to Max Weber, the monopoly on violence, right? So presumably if there's, violence going on in the state has some relationship to it, responsibility for it, or is making choices. And again, that goes to the powerlessness of collective Jewish life before Zionism, which is not only our physical bodies not protected, our legal civil personhood is not respected in any way whatsoever. Right? So Jabotinsky takes the experience of Kishinev and transforms it into his experience of Zionism, which is that the Jews are going to be forever vulnerable unless they have the power, the physical power, the military power, the state sovereignty to be able to protect themselves. Now, on a certain level, you could argue there's a political assessment being made there. And in many ways, I do think Jabotinsky is the most serious Zionist political thinker before the state. Right? He has a real theory of politics, a real theory of agency, right? He looks at the world and he understands it's not a simple place, right? He famously cites the Latin dictum, I think it is, right? Man is wolf to man, right? He looks at the world and he kind of sees it as it is. But part of the challenge with Jabotinsky is he takes the experience of the pogrom, which is the experience of victimhood, and he says, we can fundamentally redeem that if we are strong enough, right? That if we are strong enough, we will never be in that position again. Right. And that promise that he essentially makes behind Zionism is something that echoes throughout Zionist history, whether you identify with Jabotinsky or not, because it's the very promise that Zionism makes after the Shoah. Right. The Shoah itself represents this moment of absolute powerlessness, absolute vulnerability. And Israel stands for the possibility of never again. Right. That powerlessness can be redeemed and never prevented once more. Right. So to be a Zionist is on some level to believe the Jews are now, I hate to say it, but I'll say it, indestructible. We have power. Nobody can really do to us what they ever did once before, right? We are now in charge, and that means nobody's going to make us the victim anymore. Now, where I think this becomes particularly important in terms of understanding what comes after October 7th is, I would say in some ways, the fantasy that Jabotinsky offers, which is that victimhood can be overcome with enough power and with enough violence. Right? Part of the thing about being a victim is that you have your power taken away from you. Right? The world collapses. You don't even have control over your own body. It gets violated to such a degree. Right? Power gives one the fantasy that not only will you be able to protect yourself, that you can actually impose your will on others. That's what violence is. It's imposing your will on others directly. And I think what I saw again in the war after October 7th, The question of whether it was a just war or not, right, there was important work that had to be done, right? There is no future for Jews and Palestinians in this land as long as Hamas is in charge of Gaza. There just isn't, right? Not a future that I want to be a part of, not a future that I assume you or anybody here actually wants to be a part of. But what also sat behind that violence to a very large degree, and it was very clear living in Israel at that time, was the fantasy that with enough power and violence, we will never have to be victims again. And if victimhood is the feeling of having your control of the world totally taken from you, power and violence can provide the sense that, as I said before, you could impose your power, yourself, your will on the world around you. And the beauty of power and violence, when it's used, and we've seen this particularly the last few months with the Iran war, is that power and violence, as opposed to diplomacy, always does things on the world. Right? When you use violence, you see the direct results of it. You blow things up. You make a lot of dead bodies. And for an individual or a people that are trapped in a sense of powerlessness and a sense of victimhood, even if it's justified, it's a very big temptation to be able to turn toward power and violence, and more importantly, to be blinded by what the consequences of that power and violence might ultimately be. Right? You mentioned also this sense that, after a year and a half, 2 years of war, we have an ability to be able to stop, to think, to be able to look at where we are, where we need to go, that Israel is now, Fortress Israel, Sparta on the Mediterranean, whatever you want to call it. I suppose Sparta was on the Mediterranean itself,
sure was.
more or less. But what I think is important to keep in mind is that, at least for me and my understanding of Zionism has always been about agency and responsibility, because politics is ultimately about agency and responsibility. And one of the things that I've come to realize about Zionism is that you cannot be a victim and an agent at the same time. Right? Zionism writ large tends to assume that that's actually possible. Yes, we were victims, and we have to remember that. We hold on to that threat, that vulnerability, but we also have to be powerful, and we can be responsible and put limits on our power. Now, the reason that victimhood and agency can't necessarily live together at the same time is because victims tend to lose the sense that they are implicated in the things that happen to them. Victims tend to lose the sense that they actually have power and act on the world, and that those actions ultimately have consequences. Agency is not about saying that the world is fair. Agency is about being able to look at the world as it is, whether we like it or not, right? Anti-Semitism may be as real, and it may be a deadly threat. But at the same time, it doesn't mean that we can live without taking into full consideration that it's a reality that has to be something that is contingent on how we view the world and how we act. Now, the last thing I'll say is that this is not an easy line to walk. If you tell most people who see themselves as victims that they got to let go of their victimhood if they want to truly be agents, right, it sounds like you're saying something cruel, right? Because it is, in a certain sense, cruel. Victimhood is a reality. It's the actual lived pain of profound suffering. But I think this is where, in some ways, I'm a Zionist in a very deep sense. Zionism was about taking collective responsibility for the Jewish people. And part of taking responsibility means taking responsibility for our pain and not allowing it to determine our future. That doesn't mean we ignore it historically or what the consequences might be that sit behind it, but we can't let it define the very picture of how we see ourselves in the world.
So this is where I think the language really matters, because your characterization of Jabotinsky Zionism was about the insistence that Zionism would prevent this thing from happening again, as opposed to a different understanding, which would be Zionism was the refusal to see these things happening and not enable us to constitute a significant response. And those are big differences, right? So the way Yossi Klein Halevi talked about it was his resistance to any analogies between October 7th and the Shoah was, A, the numbers, but B, more importantly, no Jewish community in history that experienced a pogrom had the Israeli army the next day to respond. So
nuclear weapons.
Or nuclear weapons. So the point is not, are we preventing violence against Jews? It's just, do we have agency to be able to respond? Because of that difference, you insist that you can't be a victim and an agent at the same time. But I wonder whether that's actually part of the transcendent and challenging experience of being modern Jews, is that we can be vulnerable, even to the point sometimes of victimhood, and we have agency at the same time, and that the challenge of our times is not to reject victimhood, but to embrace it as part of the condition of being a Jew. That is neither Zionism nor American Jewish affluence, influence, power, and privilege have gotten rid of, right? That's going to be there. but that we have to figure out how to actually be victims and agents at the same time. And I'll just say, like, by analogy, David Hartman, his essay on Auschwitz or Sinai, which actually motivates a lot of the kind of school of thought that I think you are a part of in some way. And I'm not attributing it directly to you, but the argument of we can no longer be the people who define our moral condition by having escaped Auschwitz, which gives us this kind of permission slip to do whatever we want. Morally, we have to understand that coming into the land of Israel, it ties us to covenantal obligations about moral responsibility more than victimhood. But even Hartman himself had a post-Second Intifada shift when it was easy for optimists to lose some of that optimism, to start recognizing that there are other agents in this place who are shaping the narrative of the Jewish people. And by the end of his life, he was willing to say that he was so devastated by the moral silencing that the Holocaust was creating that he wanted to just eliminate it and focus on covenantal responsibility. But if he were to do it again, he would have tried to figure out what the story of those of us who believe in agency have to do to actually reckon with the endurance of victimhood and vulnerability. So it's just hard for me to think of these as like sequential or separate from each other. I feel like the real challenge we have to hold is what if it's possible that these two things are true at the same time?
Let me try to answer your question because you make an excellent point by trying to define what I mean by victimhood. Because again, it's a word that is used frequently, but the connotations and the meaning behind it shifts depending on what you're ultimately trying to do with it. Now, if we think of like the German philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche, just as a point of reference or point of contrast, he sees suffering as something that ultimately at a certain level might need to be forgotten, right? It's one of his strategies, not the only one, right? That suffering needs to be forgotten if you're going to be able to move past it. Now, when I say you can't be a victim and an agent at the same time, I'm not saying you must forget your suffering. That might be inhuman, right? To be able to expect somebody to do that. And in fact, it might be immoral, right? If your vulnerability actually becomes critical to how you view the suffering of others in the world in ways that actually make responsibilities for you, right? But the challenge is that victimhood is not as simple as remembering the fact that we suffered once. Right? Victimhood often comes with a certain way of looking at the world. Right? Victimhood often comes with its own fantasies and its own paranoia. Right? Anti-Semitism, the experience of anti-Semitism, particularly for Jews outside of Israel, but Jews in Israel as well, at times can be correctly described as a sort of paranoia. What do I mean by that? Aren't there anti-Semites everywhere? Of course there are. But the problem is, just because there might be anti-Semites everywhere doesn't mean everywhere you look there's an anti-Semite. Right? And just because you're crazy doesn't mean that they're not out to get you. But the problem is, if you're crazy, you're going to misidentify who are the people that are actually out to get you, right? That victimhood, like I said, comes with a certain fantasy that often distorts how we see the world. Using the example of the post-Second Intifada, Israeli Zionists hadn't really been able to even see who were the actors, right? Who had agency, who was shaping the conflict and where it ultimately might go. Even for those of us who identify more as left or liberal, I think even after 18 years of Bibi being in power, we still didn't fully grasp how much it wasn't us who were driving the truck anymore, right? That there had been other people at the wheel for a very, very long time. But to capture what I mean again about victimhood and agency, I'll turn to the Torah itself, to the experience of the Jewish people, right? There were no greater victims, you might say, according to the Torah, than the Jewish people, right? 400 years of slavery in Egypt, profound suffering, attempted genocides, right? Jews easily win the victimhood Olympics. They're liberated from slavery. They're freed by God. They leave Egypt. But what's clear is even though they've left Egypt, they haven't really left Egypt. They maybe left it physically, but not really, in their heads. And every time they face a profound challenge, a challenge that is going to ask more of them than they feel they are capable of, what do they keep doing? They keep saying, we want to go back to Egypt. Now, God actually punishes the Jewish people repeatedly for this desire to want to go back to Egypt rather than step up and take responsibility for the challenge in front of them. And what's interesting is that you could easily make the justification, right, especially if you want to use contemporary critical theory, post-colonialist thought, right? How dare you hold the Jewish people responsible for the fact that they didn't like the man? Right? For the fact that they were scared that there are a lot of strong, powerful nations in the land of Israel and they're going to have to go conquer it, right? How could you dare hold them responsible? Who does God think God is? And again, I think part of the message we have to take from that is that God recognizes that victimhood will shape how we look at ourselves and how we look at the world in profoundly damaging and distorting ways. But God says, you know what? You are still responsible. Now, what's interesting, of course, and this sits at the heart of much of what Shalom Hartman stands for, right, is that God does not want the Jewish people to forget the suffering of Egypt. Right? That's the last thing God wants, because the whole premise when they enter the land of Israel is they have to remember that they were slaves, that they were the stranger. So the challenge that the Torah seems to be presenting us is that we do have to hold on to that pain in some way, but we cannot let it distort the way we see the world or the way we see ourselves. And we are going to face challenges that seem profoundly, profoundly unfair. That's what God is telling them. And you know what? You still got to step up to the plate. There's no clause or footnote between the lines of the Torah hiding in the back somewhere that says just if the anti-Semites get really bad, then you don't really have to hold to some of the laws that are in here, right? You just do whatever you need to survive, right? You're not going to really find that in the Torah anywhere, because at the end of the day, even when things seem impossible, we still have to take responsibility for who we are, the reality that we have built, and what we're going to do next.
But this is where you get your devil quotes scripture problem, right? Because yes, I have one narrative thread, which I love to emphasize in my teaching also. And the way I oftentimes teach on this is you have three massive moral lessons that emerge for the Jewish people post-Shoah that are in theory compatible, but are oftentimes weaponized against each other, which is don't be a victim, don't be a perpetrator, don't be a bystander. And one way to describe what's going on in the Jewish people today is like a three-part choice that are being weaponized against each other. By the same token, the Torah's lessons around, since you were victim in the land of Egypt, you must not be a perpetrator of victimhood over those who you control when you're in land. But that skips over a lot, including the book of Joshua, right? And the arrival and conquest in the land, where God is not only instructing the Israelites not to long back for Egypt, God also is instructing the Israelites not to exercise any hesitation, ambivalence, or caution in actually creating the conditions for total sovereignty in the land of Israel. And I think that creates a kind of theological justification for those who would say, you insist that there's no possibility of absolute victory. But that itself is a theological or political lack of the conviction that one needs to do to obliterate the evil that's in your midst in order to create the conditions for then you become a compassionate people to those who are actually not the victims. So it feels like a lot of this hinges on two choices. One is I choose to read this as opposed to that. And the second is I choose to believe that because I think that Israel can never actually destroy Hamas, therefore I'm going to choose a moral framework that sits there. Those responses that you said, the apologetic responses, what if they were possibly true? What if there was a scenario of absolute victory? What does that do to the moral narrative that you're constructing here?
So I want to go back to the line that you made, which is a very good line, right? That the devil quotes scripture.
Yeah.
So what's interesting, I'll note, is that is not a line that we typically associate with the Jews.
Yeah.
And I think there's a reason that's not a line that we typically associate with the Jews, because the whole Jewish condition, right, post the destruction of the temples, right, the whole Jewish condition is such that when you are faced with a question, what are we supposed to do?
Interpretive tradition.
Right? You pull a pasuk out and you try to make sense of it. Right? And I think that's very, very interesting, right? Because it presumes on some level that there's a obvious and absolute truth to the Torah, that as long as one can cite the right way, one can justify what is necessary, but we shouldn't misuse it.
Yeah.
Right? That's not the way I look at the Torah. I don't think it's the way that you look at the Torah. But it actually presents us with a profound dilemma. Because if verses can be taken out of their context, and those verses can be used and reinterpreted to justify all sorts of things, right, that seems like an invitation to nihilism, right? There's something deeply unsettling about that, deeply, deeply unsettling, to say the least. Now, what's interesting, of course, is that the Talmud at least seems to think that nevertheless, that is the fundamental condition of being a Jew. When the rabbis are faced with the possibility that we can know with certainty what God wants, or we're going to have to just kind of own it ourselves, take a vote, and live with it, they choose the latter and not the former, right? And the proof that they bring for that is the famous verse, of course, a verse cited out of context, right? They're essentially, Daniel Webster or whatever it is, the devil citing scripture, right? Lo b'shamayim hi, right? It is not in heaven. Now, I think what we have to understand about that, and I think this is, again, somewhat discomforting, but really essential to what the entire Torah's message is on a certain level, is that when the rabbis say the Torah is not in heaven, What they mean is that we now have to be responsible for our choices, and we are now also going to have to be responsible for the consequences. Because we no longer have God up there in the heaven being able to step out and tell us exactly what to do. And the whole Jewish tradition is premised on the realization that now, guys, we have to own it. And what's fascinating is you could say, well, this is the rabbinic break after the destruction. They don't have access to God's word, right? They have to live with that uncertainty. They have to live with pluralism, right? Otherwise, they're going to tear themselves apart. How are they going to build community? How are they going to have continuity? You can say all of those things. But what's ironic, of course, is that if you look at Moses' final speech to the Jewish people, if you look at the book of Deuteronomy, right, what becomes clear again and again and again, that Moses pretty much has one message for the Jews. He says, once you cross that Jordan River, you're going to have laws, you're going to have commandments, but it's ultimately going to be on you. That's why he says you have a choice, right? There's life and there's death. You better choose life, right? Because at the end of the day, it's still ultimately on you. Moses is the loving father, knowing he's not going to be there to see his children take the future forward. And what's fascinating, of course, is the position that Moses presents there is the position that every parent finds themselves in. My oldest son is 19. I imagine her oldest is around that age too, probably. It's the moment where you start to realize that your children are actually going to become adults, even though you might not have ever thought that was possible. And if you take that seriously, it's also the realization that your children are going to live beyond you. They're going to have lives in which you are not a part of because you won't be around at some point. And they're going to have to live, and they're ultimately going to have to be responsible for themselves. So to go back to your point about religion and politics and land and war, right? At a certain level, we use religion as a cop-out for the basic fact that we are responsible for this mess. Right? One of the things that I mentioned in the book is that the reality of the Holocaust is the reality that every Jew afterwards has to face, which is that no matter how bad things get, there probably isn't somebody coming to save us. Right? That's just a reality, right? You have to be willing to accept that, which means essentially it is now on us. Now, I think the challenge, of course, I said religion is used to be able to give us the certainty, to be able to allow us to build narratives from which we feel that we don't have to receive or grapple with any kind of criticism or contradiction, whatsoever, right? I cannot promise that the narrative of the Torah I will teach you or teach it to my students is God's truth, right? So in a certain extent, the only way it can ultimately be judged is by the kind of world that it produces, right? By the kind of consequences that it ultimately brings about. When we think about Zionism and we think about Israel today, one of the things that concerns me the most is that in a lot of ways, Zionism saw itself as bringing the Jewish people into adulthood, right? Yeah. Most of Jewish history after the destruction, most of Jewish history during exile, it was as if we were children because we were dependent on the Goyim. We were dependent on non-Jews. We were dependent on the world around us. We weren't masters of our own destiny. Zionism was going to make us have the ability to determine our future. That's what an adult gets to do. Yeah. An adult gets to have the autonomy to make decisions for themselves, and their parent doesn't get to say anymore, no, I want you to do this. I don't want you to do that. But the problem with becoming an adult, and this in many ways is the basic message of the Torah again and again, is that becoming an adult means learning to accept limits. It means learning to realize that you are not the master of the universe and the world does not fully revolve around you. When we're children, we kind of think our parents are gods, right? They can do anything. They can know everything. They can solve every problem. But then when your kids get older or you get older, you look at your parents and you realize maybe they're not like Superman. Maybe they actually have faults and failures. One of the hardest things as a parent, as I said, is to get kids to recognize that there are limits, right? The challenge that I never thought I would ever have as an adult, as a parent, is bedtime, right? When you're young, I don't remember bedtime being so hard or me making it such a big difficulty for my parents. I have 3 boys and a girl ages 9 to 19. And bedtime is like the bane of our existence for my wife and I, for all of them, because it just takes so much effort just to get them in bed.
That ends, by the way. You should know.
It does and it doesn't, right? My 19-year-old is now home and he's still up to 1, 2, 3 a.m.
That's not your problem anymore.
Well, he's still there the next day, so I'm not so sure that's the case. But one of the things that you have when your kids are adolescents, of course, is my boys, they want to stay up as late as they can. Yeah. And they will always tell me, Abba, I don't really have to go to bed. I'll be fine the next morning. And then I get into a screaming match with them. No, you got to go to bed, blah, blah, blah. Right? Maybe they stay up. They said, I'll find a way to do it or whatever. But of course, the next morning comes and they're not fine, right? They're too tired. They don't want to get up. They can't get to the bus on time or whatever it is. right? That becoming an adult is about internalizing that there are limits. Zionism was in many ways about taking the Jewish people into adulthood, but Zionism in practice, it struggles with the very idea of limits, right? What is Herzl's famous statement? And you were already hinting to it before, right? Im tirtzu ein zo agada, right? If you will it, it is not a dream. Part of the Zionist conceit, the Zionist fantasy, is that if you want it bad enough and you're willing to sacrifice enough, there is no obstacles. Well, I hate to break it to the Zionists, but we have this thing called the Torah, the Bible, that tells you that if you are human, there are always obstacles. There are always limits. And the problem is, if you think you can transcend the limits, right, you're going to keep acting in ways that are not particularly in consonance with reality. And if you try to exceed the limits, reality is going to have a way of coming back and getting you. I think in many ways, probably where the difficulty with limits matters most, and we see it most present in Israeli society, is the very lack of a constitution. There's something very strange about Zionism, which builds its whole worldview out of the Bible. And if there is one message that the Bible keeps affirming again and again and again and again and again, it's that power needs to be held in check, that power needs to be accountable, that power has limits. All right? Famous idea. The king, the Jewish king, has his own Sefer Torah he has to carry around at all times, big enough for people to see it. All right, could you imagine the sight? We'll use President Trump for a moment. If Trump had to walk it around at all times with the Constitution in his hands,
very likely.
Right? It almost like comical, right? The sheer hypocrisy of how many of us would view that act, that he would say and do the things that he does while holding the Constitution. Right? There's something very powerful, this idea that the king holds the Torah because the Torah comes to limit the king, right? And we see it throughout the Bible itself. The kings abuse their power, they oppress, they exploit, they're violent, right? They're oppressive. And yet Zionism, which sees itself emerging primarily from the Bible, from the Tanakh, builds the state and doesn't have a constitution. And the whole idea of a constitution is that there are limits on power.
Yeah, but you're blurring two things here, right? Because Gershom Scholem famously says Zionism has never really known itself whether it is a movement of continuity or a movement of revolt. Mm-hmm. Your argument holds to me about interpretation of the Torah. It holds to me about this notion of Jewish moral accountability. And I, as an educator, feel that that too is my primary voice and responsibility. It's less about what they do and more about what we do, right? Doesn't mean geopolitically. And that is consistent with the notion that Zionism is basically coming out of this biblical tradition. But it's not consistent with the notion that Zionism is also a realpolitik reaction to the powerlessness of Jews in the 19th and 20th century, that it emerges as a state to give back the Jewish people control and agency over their own story, that it is held accountable by, or should be held accountable, not by the Bible, but by the structures of liberal democracy, but that it also operates in a world where there are sometimes adversaries and wars, and that there is a plausible belief, which I think got shattered for a lot of Americans by 9/11. There's a plausible belief that those wars are winnable. And that's where I want to hear what you have to say, which is, again, if it was conceivable, if an argument could have been made that the war was winnable, or the argument holds that Hamas is principally responsible, why do you interpret all of those reactions as being apologetic? Why are those things an avoidance of moral seriousness and not plausible positions that also require a different kind of moral seriousness? If we agree that it's not viable existentially and morally to function with a strong Hamas, then why do you go to the place of whenever someone says that like everything is to be blamed on Hamas, you view that as kind of avoidance and moral apologetic?
Do you think everything either with October 7th or the war that followed can be blamed on Hamas?
I'm not saying everything, but what you described it as like you knew immediately post-October 7th that the moral onus, and I don't mean as an educator, but I mean as an Israeli, that the primary moral onus at that point lived on Israel and that it was going to fail. And that's what I'm trying to decode a little bit, is whether there is room in that analysis for we're going to do whatever we can to be moral critics of our people during this time while holding open a modest amount of humility for the possibility that the counter-moral position is also a moral position.
So what I think is important to clarify for myself and for you is my own sort of sense of these things. Amongst my friends who may have even more serious criticisms about Israel than I do, I'm seen as like the realpolitik guy. I'm seen as the one who's maybe too willing to use force. I remember at the beginning of both wars with Iran, right? There was a part of me that was very much caught up with the notion that maybe this is necessary, maybe this is winnable, maybe we're going to do something here that really changes the future of Israel and the Middle East, of the Iranian people, the Palestinians, like for the better, right? I wanted to hold myself open to that possibility. That was certainly true in the more recent war with them. I wanted to hold myself open to that possibility, and I wanted to be able to say, we're not going to judge things just because somebody doesn't like Bibi or somebody doesn't like Trump, that means this can't be a success. And I think that's critical. If you can't hold open the space for that, and I would say there's a lot of people in certain sense of the political spectrum that simply cannot, right? You're foreclosing reality, right? You're foreclosing the possibility of being disappointed, of seeing that what you think isn't what it is. I would say in the case of that war, reality kind of proved itself over time, that it either wasn't designed or initiated or fought in a way that was winnable. It may never have been winnable. I mean, I'm not a military expert here, right? Part of what's so interesting is the assumption that citizens need to be able to know plausibly whether wars are winnable or not, right? Am I given the information that would be necessary to make that decision, Yehuda, as a citizen of Israel? Absolutely not, right? There is absolutely no way I, as a citizen, could assess whether the military use of force is going to be successful or not. Right. So once you recognize that, right, I think the responsible position is, as you said, right, we have to be open to reality surprising us, but we also have to assume that if I don't have the information and we know the state is the one initiating this, then starting with a default critical position is probably not the worst thing in the world when it comes to wars. If you want to ask yourself about all the wars in the 20th century, that if you took the default position that this was a bad war, do you think you'd be right at the very beginning of each war? Do you think you'd be right most of the time or not? You tell me, right? Most of the time you'd be right? The number of truly good wars in which force did what we wanted it to do, pretty small number at the end of the day. Doesn't preclude the possibility that it can happen, but it's still a pretty small number at the end of the day. I think for me in the wake of October 7th was the lack of any articulated endpoint and strategy that was supposed to get us there. All right, that was very, very clear to me that I looked for it. I think I suddenly became familiar with the INSS website, right? INSS, it is the home in Israel for strategic studies. It is a quasi-governmental entity in which its whole job is to present strategic analysis of Israel's most dire challenges. And it does it in a fairly even-handed way, meaning it's not really political. It does, take in competing views. And I sat there trying to read pieces about, okay, what is really happening with the Gaza war? Where is this going? What's really happening? Do we have this choice or we don't have this choice? Right? Part of what I also became a little bit disillusioned by, and I write about this in the book, is that democracies, when it comes to war, depend on their citizens supporting the war. Right? And that's never more true than in Israel, because we have what is essentially not just a citizen army, but if you look at these moments as being of existential, danger, it means the whole citizenry has to be able to step in and willing to act and to sacrifice in order to be able to defend ourselves. If war requires, and it does here in Israel, that everybody get behind it, then there is a profound, profound incentive on behalf of those who start the war to project the kind of information that they think people need to hear to keep supporting the war. Right? This has actually become an issue. If you look, there's studies on this, right? That Israeli military deaths are the things that will stop wars the quickest. Right? One of the interesting things, if you look at the Gaza war, was how many soldiers were killed in comparison to other Israeli conflicts, other military conflicts. Right? The Yom Kippur War, a significantly greater number of soldiers were killed, maybe several hundred more than throughout October 7th and the whole, Gaza war. Right? Part of what was also striking to me is that the war with Hamas was existential. That was at least what I was told. But if it was existential, then why were we willing to risk whatever lives we needed to defeat Hamas, right? If Hamas is an existential threat and Zionism exists to protect the Jewish people from existential threats, then we should be willing to make the sacrifices that are necessary in order to do that. In 1948, 10% of the Jewish population, right? 6,000 out of 600,000 were killed. If this is really it, then we got to be willing to do what's necessary. That's not what I saw. And again, I think it's pretty clear that part of the lack of willingness as it related to how the war was fought and what dangers it might pose to soldiers was the fear that we need the population to be behind this. We need to create the conditions in which that support will continue as long as possible, even if that precludes the war being fought and won in the way that it needed to be. I hate to sound so cynical. I mean, I understand what I'm saying might be hard for people to hear. It does not come from the sense of How dare we use power? Oh, I want to be morally pure, right? Politics means your hands are not only going to be dirty, they're going to be bloody. And you need to live with that and not disavow that. But at the same time, when I was approaching these questions, I approached them from the position of a citizen, a father, a husband, and a rabbi, and somebody who's looking out in the Israeli world around me and not seeing pretty much anybody who was willing to ask hard questions about what we're doing and where is it taking us.
I think if I lived here, as you do, I would be in your seat. I identify with how you think about Torah. Our institute is identified with these same kind of ideas. We are like investigate your own responsibility more than removing your agency by making it about others. I think one of the things I struggle with as an American Jewish leader in this context is that the same conversation, when it takes place within the American Jewish community, I think it's thrilling, right? When we're able to detach a little bit from the instinctual behaviors towards unity and solidarity, which cut off our moral imagination and our curiosity, when we're able to do what you're talking about, I think it's vital. At the same time, presumably your children are going to serve in the army. May it be the case that before that happens, there is peace. But your kids are probably going to serve in the army. I have colleagues who are rightly identifiable as anti-Zionists, and their kids are fighting in Gaza. They are inside a discourse in a totally different way. That means that also when you're making arguments from within Jewish tradition, you're operating within the operative discourse of Israeli society, which is leveraged by the right to use the power of Jewish tradition to make a particular type of argument. I live in an environment where Jewish language is so dominated in American Judaism by the assumption that Jews are supposed to be Rachmanim b'nei Rachmanim. That's who we are, and that the very construct of Jewish power is anathema to an enormous number of Jews. And I'm curious how you are navigating that question, because my struggle, which probably we're in the same place. After October 7th, I wrote that I think that the war against Hamas is a just war, and that our responsibility was to ensure that it was fought justly. And that just led to people dunking on me for months that I was pro-genocide, right? Even though it felt to me like a totally morally stable position. So I'm wondering how you're thinking about your responsibility as an activist within Israeli society, as an Israeli, versus the way that it now partners with movements and ideas in the American Jewish community that are operating within, I would say, a different Overton window of moral discourse as it relates to Israel.
So one of the interesting things for me, as it comes to how I think about Torah, how I think about Israel, I think about Zionism, I think about politics, is that I try not to look to Torah to justify a pre-existing set of ideological beliefs, which is exactly the same thing that everybody says when they are the kind of person who turns to justify their ideological beliefs. But what I mean by that is I try to look at the Torah and see what kind of structures does it present us about what a human life can and should be and what kind of society we can and should have. Now, the interesting thing is, as human beings, we tend not to learn nearly as much from our successes as we learn from our failures. And one of the things that the Tanakh does uniquely is that it showcases the failures of the Jewish people to an absurd degree, to a profoundly absurd degree. No other people in history have or will likely ever do such a thing, right? So there's something very profound about that. Why are we putting our failures on display, right? On the one hand, I think it's to recognize just how similar and repeatable those failures are, that it's not like every failure was unique in its own way, right? Every failure starts looking pretty similar at the end of the day. Power, abuse, betraying covenant, turning to idolatry, right? There's a similar theme that we see continually repeating. I think that's important because what it makes us recognize is that the fundamental sins of life are not ones that are going to come out of left field. They're ones that we're going to experience and encounter again and again and again. Second, I think what we learn from that is that we learn what are the failures that we have done as a people that lead to catastrophe, right? What are the structural conditions that make those failures possible? And I would argue, what are the failures of responsibility that enabled those catastrophes to happen? One of the worst things living after October 7th here in Israel to this day is that we still don't have a state commission that has investigated what has happened, right? It's insane. It is beyond insane. And it's not just insane at the political level, it is insane at the existential level. Because if you have a catastrophe like October 7th, if you don't investigate and try to say, how did this happen? Why did this happen? Where does responsibility lie? then all the anger and the pain and the suffering of that day and everything that follows just floats in the air. And it has nowhere to land because nobody is responsible. Bibi did a interview with 60 Minutes about a month ago or something like that, where for the first time he kind of stumbled into the words that he said sort of like, I'm responsible because I was in charge. But then he immediately said, well, everybody in the government was responsible top to bottom, right? And of course, if everybody's responsible, then nobody's responsible. Right? I think what's so terrifying about the fact we haven't had the state commission, I'm not even sure we will, right? There could be elections. It may never really happen. What that means is that the failure just haunts you. You can't learn anything from it. You can't do anything with it, right? And you can't ultimately rectify it in any way whatsoever, right? One of the things that we learn from Jewish history, we see this in Sefer Bereshit, is that fathers or parents pass on their sins to their children, right? The Torah tells us you're not supposed to punish a child for the sins of the father, but the Torah also knows that parents pass their sins down to their children. Now, there's something terrible about that because that means children are forced to have to bear burdens they shouldn't have to bear. But there is also something positive about that. I'm going to say it might sound a little strange because it gives children the opportunity to fix the failings that the parents couldn't actually fix on their own. It gives them a chance to actually redeem the parents and actually make the family be on some level what it was ultimately supposed to be. For me, at least, October 7th is a failure that wasn't something I caused, right? The root causes of it exist far before I ever came to Israel, before I was even born on some level. At the same time, I'm here, I'm responsible for it. And what terrifies me is that if we can't really learn from our failures, if we can't learn to take responsibility for the conditions that made them possible, then we are passing them down to our children. And as I said before, I use the fatherhood, the parenthood metaphor quite a bit. The idea that I'm going to pass a future onto my children here that could look worse and worse and worse and be more violent and more oppressive and more self-destructive and more blind, when I believe in what the promises of Zionism were supposed to be, and I'm sure you do as well, nothing terrifies me more. And that's exactly, I would say, what animates me in a lot of this, is the sense that I can take responsibility, not so that I can solve the problem, but maybe at the very least I can show my kids about what it means to be responsible for it. Will my children serve in the army? Probably, right? Will I be totally happy about that? Probably not, right? I've thought about there may be circumstances where what would it mean for me as a father to try to prevent one of my sons from being in the army? It's not something I would do now, but under certain conditions I could imagine that being a thing that I would do. But children have to make their own decisions. And when they enter the army, that's kind of the age when they get to start making their own decisions.
And in that sense, it doesn't bother you that this movement implicitly makes common cause together with those who want to see radical change take place in this country, even though they don't share the underlying existential commitment to the state of Israel or to Jewish self-preservation and power, because that's one of the consequences that happens within an open marketplace of ideas.
So I think one of the things it's also important for me to emphasize here is that one of the major themes of the book is a call for teshuvah, right? And when I say a call for teshuvah, it means a lot of things. At the very least, it means, as I said in the beginning, in relation to October 7th, when the crisis comes, you have to do teshuvah. You have to do teshuvah in the sense that you have to ask yourself in what way you might be responsible for the conditions that made the crisis possible. And you have to do teshuvah in the sense that you have to recognize you're responsible for what you do next. Right? That's the basic level of teshuvah that I think Zionism in Israel has to do in wake of October 7th and still hasn't really quite done yet. A state commission would be part of that. Elections will be part of that. But it's still there's so much more long way to go. And the more you bury these things for longer, the harder it is to actually surface them and talk about them. One of the things that's important for me, very, very important for me, and it's why I still very much identify as a Zionist, is that you can't do teshuvah for something that you're not a part of. I know many people, many Jews, good-hearted Jews, who were raised as Zionists, and now they're so thoroughly disgusted by Israel and by Zionism that they reject it out of hand. And there's a part of me that is deeply sympathetic to them. Because if you catch me in my worst moments about what I think about Israel and Zionism, I probably think worse things than them. But there's a reason that I'm on the inside and not on the outside, is because at the end of the day, this is my mess, right? And you cannot change an individual or a family or a people from the outside. You can only do it from the inside. That's where the work is. I'm a rabbi. For me, my model here is Moshe Rabbeinu. This Thursday is Shiva Asar B'Tammuz. It's one of the minor fast days and commemorates different calamities that befell the Jewish people. One of them is the Nishtabru HaLuchot, right? The breaking of the Luchot, the Ten Commandments, right? Moshe is on Har Sinai, Mount Sinai. He's receiving the Ten Commandments. God tells them in the midst of this, the Jewish people have made an idol, right? They've broken the covenant. They're sinning. God is incredibly incensed, right? God wants to destroy the Jewish people, right? In a certain sense, justifiably. They just made a covenant and now they're breaking it. It's horrific. He even goes one step further and he says, you know what, Moses? I'll destroy them. I'll start again with you.
Yeah.
Now, what's fascinating is if you think about that moment from the perspective of Zionism, as I said, in my worst moments, it's not that hard for me to imagine looking out at the Jewish people and imagining all of this that we have going on here is in some level Egel Zahav, the golden calf, and we're all dancing around it and don't fully realize it. In my more judgmental moments. And when you're feeling like that, there's nothing you want to do more than separate yourself from it, right? There's nothing that you want to do more than be able to say to God, let's get rid of all the bad Jews and start again with me, the good Jews, right? That's what every, activist who was a Zionist and no longer is, essentially that's the promise they want, right? Let's cut it loose, start again, we're the good ones, let's move forward. Now, what's fascinating is Moshe has every right to do that. He's also been profoundly frustrated by the Jewish people, right? They've sinned again and again and again. He knows they're probably not going to be better than this. But what does Moses do? He advocates for the people. Mm-hmm. He says, you can't do this. You can't. Even if it's kind of what I want, you can't do it. And then he does something really fascinating. After he's come down from the mountain, he still judges the people. He still kills a lot of Jews for what they've done, because what they've done is truly aberrant and it needs to be rectified in some way. But at the very end, when God still won't forgive them, when God still on some level may even want to destroy them, Moses says to God, he says, you know what? If you want to destroy them, you're going to have to destroy me too. Yeah. Right? That's how close his identification is with the people. He's willing to judge them, but he's also willing to bear their suffering. If there's one thing that I think every rabbi has to learn if you're going to be a successful rabbi, I was a synagogue rabbi for a long time, is that you're going to, as much as your congregation or your people or your community is going to anger you and frustrate you, as much as you're going to fight for justice and realize that many of them need to be punished, at the end of the day, you're going to have to love them and realize that you are part of them. You cannot separate your future from them. And I think people who think that you can do that are deeply, deeply mistaken. Now, I think, again, when I raise critique of Israel, it's very easy to see, well, you're strengthening anti-Zionism, you're strengthening anti-Semitism. Yeah, I'm sure that's true. But at the end of the day, if we don't learn how to take responsibility for this mess, I don't see a future here. And the only way we can learn how to take responsibility is if we're willing to look at ourselves and ask really, really, really hard and uncomfortable questions.
Here are some other things that are happening at the Shalom Hartman Institute. The newest issue of Sources has launched online. This issue, Covenant and Country, Jewish in America, is part of the Hartman Beit Midrash for America at 250. It is a call to recommit to the American project and to explore what American Judaism has to offer this moment. Read, share, and subscribe at the link in the show notes. Did you miss our live-streamed programming from Jerusalem last week? Don't worry. You can check out our YouTube channel for recordings of those sessions, and more will be live-streamed this week. Subscribe to our YouTube channel so that you don't miss a session.
Thanks for listening to our show, and special thanks to our guest, Zachary Truboff. Identity Crisis is produced by me, Tessa Zitter, and our executive producer is Maytal Friedman. This episode was researched by Gabrielle Feinstone and edited by Josh Allen, with music provided by SoCalled. Transcripts of our show are now available on our website, typically a week after an episode airs. We're always looking for ideas for what we should cover on future episodes. So if you have a topic you'd like to hear about, or if you have comments on this episode, please write to us at identitycrisis@shalomhartman.org. For more ideas from the Shalom Hartman Institute about what's unfolding right now, sign up for our newsletter in the show notes and subscribe to this podcast everywhere podcasts are available. See you next time, and thanks for listening.